So today we're going to look at daffodils, which is the quintessential spring flower, and the month of April is pretty much their peak season, really, although some will start as early as January and some will carry on until almost the end of May. So there are many, many varieties of daffodils, and the intention of today's little vlog is just to give you some idea of how to think about daffodils in terms of the divisions in which growers used to describe them. The photography for this was done by Joe Whitworth for a book we did together about 10 years ago. And here we are on the edge of the sea at Cornwall, a county which has had a long association with daffodils. It's an ideal place for growing them, and it's the centre of the cut flower industry for the flower. A lot of daffodil varieties are referred to as Narcissus, which is really just the Latin name for the genus. There's no real distinction there isn't any distinction between daffodils and Narcissus, and unless I'm using a Latin name, I shall now on refer to them all as daffodils. Now, there are something like 23,000 cultivars that have been bred over the last couple of centuries. Of these, about 2,000 are commercially available. So many varieties. How do you actually make sense of them? Well, what we're going to do now is run through what daffodil growers call the divisions, which break down this vast number of hybrids and cultivars into rather more manageable sections, which is very much about their size, the number of flowers they have, and sometimes the growing conditions. It's a good way in to thinking a little bit more coherently about daffodils, and crucially to choosing the best ones for your garden. Now, we've had various daffodil cultivars probably since at least the 16th century. This is from a German book, the Hortus Eichstättensis, which was produced in the early 1600s. The ancestry of many modern daffodil varieties is very complex. They're bred by specialist growers who combine from many different cultivars. And all of these cultivars, of course, are all themselves derived from original species. And this is the wild daffodil. There's around about 50 species of wild daffodil. This is the one, Narcissus hispanicus, which is the sort of dominant one for most of our cultivated daffodils. And it's got that great big trumpet, which brings us to our first division, the trumpets, where the so-called trumpet, which is a real evolutionary novelty in the genus Narcissus, is really prominent and indeed longer than what's called the perianth segments, which are the combined sepals and petals that form the rear end of the flower and have far more in common with the typical shape of most flowers. This has been commercially one of the most successful. King Alfred is the kind of daffodil, the one that's planted in the thousands by local authorities along roadsides to cheer us all up in the spring. It's like many of these classic varieties, was bred towards the end of the 19th century. Now, trumpet daffodils are tall. They're often around about 40 centimetres. They have one flower per stem and that really big prominent trumpet. Most of them are yellow, but by no means all of them. There's some lovely white varieties as well. Division 2 are called large cupped because the trumpet or cup is a bit smaller. It's more than a third, a bit less than the length of those perianth segments, which in this variety, which is quite a modern variety, are white. And the cup here is, well, daffodil growers would call it pink. I think the rest of us might just call it apricot. So these large cup daffodils, pretty much the same size really as the trumpets, and again, one flower per stem. Small cupped have this very much smaller cup or trumpet, and very often this is orange edged, which shows that a lot of the parentage is from the species Narcissus poeticus. Again, they're tall, one flower per stem. When we get to Division 4, we've got the doubles. Now, a lot of the doubles, most of them, are modern, but not all of them. Some indeed possibly date back to the Middle Ages, and because daffodils are incredibly long-lived plants and they're very good at reproducing themselves through division of the bulbs, those older ones have been around for a long time. The pattern of doubling of floral segments can vary enormously. Personally, I don't really care for them much, as indeed a lot of people don't particularly like them. So perhaps they are really a bit of a curiosity. Now, when we get to Division 5, we're getting to those daffodils that are derived from different and usually smaller species. Triandrus are derived from the species native to Spain and Portugal, Narcissus triandrus. This is Thalia, which is an old variety and still very popular. Triandrus are small to medium and they have multiple flowers for each stem, and they also have that distinctively shaped cup or trumpet. I don't quite know how to describe it, but once you see it, you never forget it, because that's the true triandrus shape. When we get on to Division 6, these are the derivatives of Narcissus cyclaminius, which is quite a rare plant from Spain and Portugal. It's a small plant of woodland, has these very prominent straight trumpet and this extraordinary perianth, which is reflexed all the way back. I mean, it really is quite an odd-looking flower. But the varieties that have been bred from Cyclaminius are many and deservedly very popular. They're small, they have one flower per stem with this distinctively reflexed perianth. So they always have a little sort of look about them as if they're surprised or their petals are being blown back by the wind. And one of the great things about them is that they are early and they are hardy. So if you want flowers, February, March, Cyclaminius daffodils are really the ones to go for. And being small, they're ideal for smaller gardens. Division 7 are those derived from the jonquil of southern Europe, Narcissus jonquilla. They're yellow, or in this case, a so-called reverse bicolour, because the trumpet is a paler colour than the perianth segments. The jonquils tend to be medium size, which means they're kind of 25 to 30 centimetres very often, and they typically have multiple flowers per stem, and they are fragrant. That is something that's quite crucial about the jonquils. They have a really nice fragrance. A lot of them are a little bit later flowering, and a lot of them do quite well in warmer climates. Division 8, the Tazettas, derived from Narcissus tazetta from the eastern Mediterranean. And these are very much plants that like warmer places in the garden, free-draining, warm soils. And they are medium to tall, and they have multiple flowers per stem, quite small flowers, but they'll have quite a lot of them on top of the stem, and they have a fabulous fragrance. These are really the very best ones for fragrance, and as I mentioned, they do like it warm. Division 9, Poeticus, derived from Narcissus poeticus. Now, these are the ones that are white with this very shallow but bright orange cup. And they're tall. There's one flower per stem. Some of them are fragrant. They are the most damp tolerant. So if you've got drainage problems or a bit of a soggy soil, that's always going to be a bit of a problem for any bulbs, which really are liable to rotting. But Narcissus poeticus are the ones that are the most likely to survive and indeed flourish. And they are quite late flowering. So we're talking about April through well into May. And there are, of course, breeders have produced many hundreds of varieties, but they all tend to look pretty much pretty similar, those white perianth segments and that bright orange cup. Division 10 is a bit of a curiosity, derived from Narcissus bulbocodium, which has really quite minimal perianth and this really large cup, and these are a bit of a sort of speciality really for the rock garden, or situations where perhaps sinks or even window boxes, places which are quite high visibility and where a relatively small plant can be, with a very particular special quality to it, can be appreciated. Division 11 is a relatively recent group that a lot of people really don't like, the so-called split corona. And these have mostly been bred for the cut flower industry, because for a lot of gardeners, they simply don't look like daffodils. And we end up with Division 12. Now, these are the oddballs, the miscellaneous, and this particular plant, tete-a-tete, has been one of the most successful of all daffodils, and it very much presages what is to come, because this is the ideal plant for many of us. It's small, so it's a great plant for small gardens or window boxes or containers. It's early flowering, it's tough, it's a really good doer, and its story is rather wonderful. Alec Gray, who bred it, was a fruit grower on the Scilly Isles, whose passion was daffodil breeding. And in the late 1940s, he set off for Spain and Portugal, which was quite a brave thing to do because Spain was just recovering from a truly horrendous civil war. And he was collecting seed of wild daffodils. And he made a number of crosses between several species, many of which resulted in some really wonderful dwarf daffodils. Of these, tete-a-tete was the most successful, and this has gone on since then to be produced in the billions by the Dutch bulb industry. This is a fantastic plant for growing in pots and bringing on early to sell at garage and supermarkets all over Europe, but also just a very good hardy garden plant that will increase over many years to come. And finally, Division 13, the original species and varieties derived from those species. And here we've got Narcissus, Pseudonarcissus, which is a fairly common species in France and Central Europe. In Britain, it's found in certain localities in enormous numbers, which suggests that these were introduced, whether it was by the Romans or the Normans or by medieval monks, we don't really know. It's all a bit of a mystery, but they are a beautiful plant when they've naturalised. Like some of these other wild daffodils are, however, more of a specialist thing for alpine plant growers, but Pseudonarcissus is one of those that will naturalise over time in rough ground at the edge of a woodland or in an orchard, and is a truly lovely plant. I hope that will have given you some insight into the major and quite complex world of daffodils. And here's Ron Scamp, who has a company called Quality Daffodils that actually has something like 2,000 cultivars produced for sale in Cornwall, and keeping alive a lot of the older heritage varieties, as well as breeding some of his own. And the ability of daffodils to come back year in, year out is what makes them, of course, such a popular spring flower, and something that, with so many cultivars, some people can get really obsessed about, and they're lovely plants, a lovely thing to become obsessed about. It's just that yellow brings so much cheer to spring, and of course their versatility and durability, especially compared to tulips, makes them really good value.